Great, thank you. It's truly an honor to be here among all of you. I'm a sociologist, so this is, I think, a slightly different type of presentation than we heard yesterday. I'm going to present some research here. So in the area now called the United States, indigenous peoples experience widespread genocide, land dispossession, and forced migration by European settlers. These settlers, culminating in the United States federal government, still exert near total economic and political control, even as hundreds of indigenous communities persist there today. Scholarly research into this socio-political process, mostly by historians and anthropologists, has revealed a great deal about land dispossession and forced migration. Yet most empirical accounts are circumscribed to a particular tribe or a small area of the continent. And when or if they present aggregate level figures concerning land dispossession or forced migration, it's often based on imprecise measures. So in other words, scholars have yet to really attempt to quantify at large scales these processes of colonization. With the growing abundance of digitized records and geospatial methods, there exists a substantial opportunity to improve both the scale and the precision of the quantitative study of land dispossession and forced migration. Not only would this allow us to begin to estimate these general processes better, but perhaps more importantly, it would allow us to zero in on the specific impacts of colonial practices over time and leading up to the present day. Of course, scientific research can never quantify the true depth of cultural, spiritual, political, and economic trauma perpetuated by settler colonialism. But efforts to catalog and map and quantify land loss can help to chart the path dependencies and current and future impacts, with hopes of crafting more informed policies for justice and restitution. So using the case of North America, focused on the area that is now called the United States, my research group is attempting to test research questions and hypotheses at scale. We published our first study in the journal Science a year and a half ago and are working on several new studies using the data and analytical framework I'm laying out for you here today. So in this paper, I'm also drawing directly from this project as a way to lay out the general contours of a larger research initiative I'm leading in collaboration with Dr. Kyle White, an indigenous scholar and professor at the University of Michigan. Our approach focuses on two main research questions, and we empirically assess these in the US context, but I do think they provide a framework that should be useful across most colonial contexts around the world. And I'll do my best here to avoid getting caught in the methodological or analytical weeds. But first, we attempt to catalog and quantify land loss for every native tribe in the historical record. In other words, how much land was dispossessed, both at the individual tribe and group level, as well as in the aggregate across all tribes. If an indigenous community still has a land base in the present-day United States, where do they live now? In their ancestral areas, or were they forced to migrate to a different part of the continent? We can then aggregate these measures to understand the full extent of land dispossession and forced migration for all tribes combined. Second, and perhaps more importantly, we investigate the continued impacts of land dispossession and forced migration. Historical research shows that tribes were often forced to lands that were viewed by the settler government to be less desirable. Of course, this raises important questions about the implication of their new lands, both at the time of relocation and into the 20th and 21st centuries, as a multi-trillion-dollar land-based settler economy was built. Notably, with the right approach, we can begin to examine the impacts of climate change. Although early settler governments were unaware of the coming rise in global temperatures, with the right data, we can compare across time, assessing whether tribal lands today are in areas more vulnerable than their ancestral lands to the effects of climate change. So in order to examine these research questions, we created a new large-scale open source data set to begin to catalog instances of colonial land dispossession and forced migration. And we employ a basic comparative historical research design collecting geospatial locations of tribes at two general time points, one at the historical period and one in the present day. But because we're in the very early stages of this project, we use a very conservative definition of historical lands, defined as the earliest documented location of indigenous peoples in a geographic area. We compiled historical ancestral locations from a myriad sources, including indigenous nations' own publications and public archives, digitized administrative records of land cession treaties made between native nations and the U.S. government, judicial records, and many other settler and tribal sources. As we note in our science article, constructing the historical location of this data involved very difficult decisions concerning scale and historical lineage, as you might imagine, because contemporary tribes may be groups that identified as varied types of tribal formations during colonial periods, even though historically members may have associated to differing degrees with larger or more fluid social groups that are not themselves organized as tribes. They constitute themselves variously by clans, kinship networks, or bands, in addition to more variable instances in which multiple tribes form a larger confederation or nation of associated tribes. So our effort in this project is ambitious, but from the very beginning it was taken on with analytical humility, acknowledging these methodological and ethical difficulties as we sought to estimate historical locations prior to settler colonial forced migration. So we did so by using multiple methods and aggregated data from many historical and contemporary sources to begin to just piece together reliable estimates, especially in the historical period. And we plot these in areas large enough to accommodate the best we can for spatial heterogeneity, the diversity of indigenous land tenure systems, fluid boundaries, different modes of occupancy, and territorial claiming. All this is to say that we're starting from the ground up, and this is a living data set of historical locations that will improve over time as we collect more tribal input and more historical records of colonization as they come to light. In the past, scholars studying indigenous communities and with indigenous communities often took an extractive approach to data collection. Here in this project, we prioritize data sovereignty for tribes, whereby our data are open source from the beginning and in collaboration with Native organizations. For example, our data are stored online by a Native-led data organization. Working together, we're building a publicly available online function that will allow tribal members or others with reliable knowledge to submit geographical additions that will deepen the historical precision and reach of the data. In what follows, I'll give some visual examples of the data collection process and then demonstrate the value of the data for examining research questions pertaining to climate risks and impacts. And I'll show these on the screen if we can, if we might switch the video for a moment here. Great, thank you. So this figure is an example of a typical map we use to reconstruct historical locations of tribes and indigenous peoples in what's now the US. So this particular map is from the Smithsonian of the Paiute people in the Great Basin area of the continent, known to be inhabited around the years 1800 to 1830 and likely thousands of years before that in what is today California, Oregon, and Nevada. And the darker shading there is the estimated area of this tribe, this people. So again, these are imperfect and a product of this particular map, a product of the settler colonial record, but we do our best to pair geographic sources like this with oral history and public records provided by the tribes themselves. So this is a similar figure here, another set of historical maps from the Bureau of American Ethnology, estimating tribal locations for what is now the area of the states of Alabama on the left and Idaho on the right. And the different colors represent different tribes. So over many years, we compiled all available historical geographical information like this for a total of 390 tribes. So this just shows what it looks like when the data are cleaned up, merged, and digitized with geospatial software, we've overlaid the state of Idaho on this particular map. And on the right are the different tribes known to occupy this area. So we manually paired every tribe's estimated historical location with their present-day location. In most cases, present-day locations are the reservations to which they've been confined, often in the mid to late 1800s. And the particular legacy of colonialism in the U.S., drives some methodological decision-making, and these decisions may look very different in Europe, South America, Africa, Asia, or elsewhere. And this figure is an example of a land dispossession dyad, as we call it, where we pair the historical data with the known present-day locations. And so this figure here is for the Modoc tribe, and you can see in the far left, in the yellow, are the earliest known historical locations on the western edge of the map there. And most of these lands were dispossessed, and the tribe was forced to migrate across the continent to present-day Oklahoma, which is this tiny little blue dot you can see toward the center. Scaling up to the entire data set, this figure displays the geographical and temporal distribution of land for all tribes. So the top left displays known historical locations. You can see on that map in the top left, there's quite a bit of missing data. So that's not to suggest that tribes or indigenous people were not in those areas. But it's important to note that also for this study and for future studies that most indigenous people shared lands as well. So multiple tribes are present in the same place. The bottom left of this figure is present-day locations, fairly precise, of locations of tribes in the present day, which with the naked eye obviously reveals a sharp reduction of about 94%. The figure on the right visualizes the aggregate reduction for each individual tribe. So each dot is a tribe, and those are on log scale. So we've also attempted to catalog and visualize top-line figures of land dispossession. For example, there's a lot on here, but focus on the left here. The brown circle represents historical lands again in the aggregate, and the much smaller blue dot represents the aggregate total of present-day lands. So you can see the reduction there. And notably, the second figure on the right, 42.1, so 42% of tribes from the historical period, at least that's available again in the historical record, no longer have any land base today. So for them, colonial land dispossession was totalizing. That's 42% tribes. So quantifying land dispossession in the aggregate is useful, but one of the real payoffs of this data structure is to compare each tribe's historical lands to their present-day lands across several dimensions. So for example, were tribes moved to lands that would become more or perhaps less at risk for climate impacts? In other words, what if tribes were still living in their ancestral areas as compared to where they were forced? So the difficulty in comparing across such large timescales is that most variables are influenced by settler activities during the 19th and 20th centuries. So to help overcome this issue, we use indicators that are largely durable across time. And I'll present a few examples here related to climate change, risks, and impact. So here in this next figure, here, oh, it's not going, okay. We could move to the next slide, but if not, I can explain it. We examine how historical lands compare to present-day lands with regard to extreme heat days and then annual precipitation. And figures that we're going to show are box plots that are actually difficult to interpret, so maybe it's better I explain here. But we examine the number of extreme heat days and then annual precipitation, which are measures related to climate change. And we find that on average, tribes were moved to hotter lands and lands with less precipitation. Researchers might also examine, as we do in our initial paper, wildfire risk and drought. For example, we found that 50% of tribes saw increased wildfire risk on their present-day land as compared to historical areas. Again, it's important to stress that colonial regimes had, at the time, no knowledge of increasing greenhouse gases. But they did move tribes to less desirable lands, which in the case of the United States are hotter, drier, and at a greater risk for current and future climate impact. We also have in this project, we're looking at mineral value potential. So these sedimentary basins beneath lands to examine the potential economic value that was lost as well related to oil and natural gas. But obviously, many tribes may not have developed that if given the chance. Some may have. So in summary, I believe, along with my collaborators, that despite serious analytical and ethical issues of quantification, the practice of georeferencing land dispossession and forced migration at large scales provides new empirical insight to improve our scientific understanding of the legacies of colonialism, and not just for posterity's sake, but to begin to establish open source data sets to expand knowledge about the path dependencies that continue to shape the daily experiences of indigenous peoples today and into the future. So the data collection process will look different in different parts of the world, and in some places it may be impossible, or is likely to be impossible, to assemble a reliable data at scale, depending on the quality of the historical record, especially if the accuracy of this historical record is intentionally hidden or distorted by colonial interests. Nevertheless, using a mixture of available data sources can help to overcome some of these difficulties, especially tribal sources and other non-government sources, such as journals, oral histories, diaries, church records, and archaeological evidence. Furthermore, any macroscopic research program like this must prioritize continued data collection, tribal input, historical validation, and synthesis with ongoing historical and other qualitative approaches. As data collection improves, we will be able to provide more information at larger scales, deepening our time horizon into the past, while at the same time improving estimates of vulnerability now and into the future. And the hope is that this information, can provide a basis for ongoing efforts to decolonize, to support movements for tribal self-determination and sovereignty, and promote the common good. Thank you.
Okay.